here, and I have a lot of things to say, and I want to get it in as quickly as I can. Hopefully keep it interesting for everybody. The topic I'm speaking on is anti-Semitism in the 21st century, and as Janie said, I kind of bill myself as the voice of Christian Zionists, or at least a voice of Christian Zionists, and also kind of a specialist on Middle Eastern affairs. I want to kind of give a disclaimer that I'm not a victim of anti-Semitism. I'm not a Jew, and I can't really purport to identify with the kind of persecution and anti-Semitism that Jewish people experience. But my heart is toward that and toward the feeling what it's trying to feel like, what it's like. But tonight, I really want to talk in more of a political analysis. As Janie said, I've been a pastor for many years. In more recent years, I've been author and lecturer. And one thing I like to say about, and I'll get into it a little more, but our Judeo-Christian heritage is really the basis, the foundation of our country. And we talk a lot about our founding documents. Probably the most important founding document of the United States is the Bible, because our entire system is structured on biblical principles in our Judeo-Christian heritage. And so what I'm speaking about tonight is going to be a biblical worldview as opposed to trying to cover all the bases. I want to just give you what I believe the Bible says that we ought to, in politics though, this isn't a Christian message to try to get people to become Christians. It's to try to get everybody to agree together to stand for biblical principles in our nation. There's 4 points I want to make tonight. Here's a quick look at them. Merriam-Webster defines anti-Semitism as hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group. So the 4 points are going to be a kind of a global picture. Anti-Semitism in the present year. Why does the world hate Jews? And then action items is all or nothing. This picture here, this map, is one of interesting. What's wrong with this picture? The caption is, "End the unjust occupation of Muslim lands by Israel." Can you spot Israel? The little line from the flag is pointing to Israel, which is in yellow, so you can really see it. Okay? One thing wrong with this map is it doesn't have Indonesia, Malaysia, and some of the Asian countries. Indonesia is the largest population Muslim country in the world. It's not even on this map. And yet somehow the propaganda of Islam has managed to twist it upside down, and David is now Goliath. Israel is now Goliath, and Islam is David. And I think this picture is worth 1,000 words. All right, it's a global problem. I want to talk about the scope and the context of the issue. It's a political and religious culture clash of civilizations. What we're seeing in the current times, I'm not speaking a lot about the refugees tonight. Maybe in Q&A we can talk about that. But we're seeing the Trojan horse effect of radical Islam. Not to say all refugees are radicals, but they're embedded in the refugees as they're coming into all the countries that they're going into, including ours. And what they're doing is they're coming in and they're establishing in the countries, the Western countries, they're establishing Islamic cultural centers. It's the same thing that the church did in the first century. Well, actually, before that, even the Romans did it. Whenever they conquered an area, they would establish a Roman culture community in that place. And that was kind of the mandate of the church as it went out to establish Christian communities in the places where they go. Islam's doing the same thing. It's the ecclesia. It's that special Trojan horse way of getting into a culture and into a community. Well, it's important, though, that we recognize that Islam is inherently anti-Semitic. And I want to explain why that's true or how that's true. It has a supremacist ideology. Well, those are two separate things, but they are intertwined. Anti-Semitism is built into Islam because of the animosity, the enmity between Ishmael and Isaac, all the way back with Abraham. And that's still there, and that's still the problem. It's not a new problem. It's not something that was caused by President Bush. It's not caused by President Obama either, for that matter. He might have, he's made it a lot worse, but he didn't start it. It's been there for a long time. And then the other thing that we need to know is that the reasoning is circular. If you start with the Quran, you'll end with the Quran. If you start with the Bible, you'll end with the Bible. And those are two different documents, and they have two different sets of beliefs. And I want to talk about those. And in the context of that, which is more dangerous, Islam or communism? For many years, our country has had communism as, the thing we have to fight against. But you know what's wrong with communism as far as a world supremacy philosophy? It's godless. It's godless atheism. And so the adherents of communism are intellectual, they make their choice, they choose, they have reasons for what they do, but they don't have that inner heart fervor that comes with a devoted religious ideology. So Islam is actually more dangerous because it has both. Don't make any mistake. If somebody says Islam is just a religion, you have to go, eh. If they say Islam is just a political ideology, a system of Sharia law, you have to go, eh, because it's both. Okay? It's religious and it's also political. And that's why it's dangerous. The West has severed our roots from the Judeo-Christian worldview that was derived from the Bible. In the Bible, Jerusalem is mentioned, for example, 700 times. In the Quran, Jerusalem is mentioned 0. Jehovah, the name of God, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, is mentioned 6,828 times. People don't know that because it's translated Lord with all caps. So every time you see Lord with all caps, the word in the Hebrew is either Jehovah or Yah, which is the short form of Jehovah. You can pronounce Jehovah, Yahweh, Yah, Lord, as it's translated in our English Bibles. Jewish people say Adonai, which means Lord, or they say Hashem, which means the name. But by whatever name or whatever term you use, the fact is the personal name of God the Father is in the Bible 6,828 times, and He's a Father. He is a Father. Now, why is that important? Because, well, presidents, first of all, are not theologians. Can we figure that out? Presidents are not theologians. We've had our last two presidents who would say Islam is a religion of peace. I think they're wrong about that. And they've also said that we all worship the same God. And that's not true. That's just not true. They don't know what they're talking about when they say that, with all due respect. We do not all worship the same God. Islam's God is not a father. Islam's God has no son. Islam's God is not Jehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There are all kinds of claims from Islam, but this is the truth. And that is the subject of my book, Simple Islam, which I only have two of my books here tonight, Simple Islam and Blessing Israel. Blessing Israel has just been published about a month or so. I just got it, so I hope you'll be interested in that after the meeting. All right, I want to give you a quote. This is from Jonathan Sachs, who is a rabbi. He was actually the former chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Commonwealth. This was an essay from his new book, Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence. And I just thought it was an excellent quote. I want to read it to you. The West was caught unprepared by the rise of Islamic State, as it was a decade and a half ago by the attacks of Al-Qaeda, and as the Soviet Union was by the determination of the Mujahideen of Afghanistan in the 1980s. These are among the worst failures of political intelligence in modern times, and the consequences have been disastrous. The unpreparedness was not accidental. It happened because of a blind spot in the secular mind, the inability to see the elemental, world-shaking power of religion when hijacked by politics. Islam didn't exactly hijack religion to put with their politics. It's actually the DNA of Islam is to have both embedded. Now, totalitarianism, we know a little about that. Here's the definition. Totalitarianism, of, relating to, being, or imposing a form of government in which the political authority exercises absolute and centralized control over all aspects of life. The individual is subordinated to the state, and opposing political and cultural expression is suppressed. Debating whether or not to make this comment. I think I will. In the news today, one of the Republican candidates is saying, I think women ought to be able to wear burqas. He has no clue what he's talking about, because that's used as a means of imprisoning women. It's a totalitarian imposition on citizens in Muslim countries under Sharia law. And that's... Oh, you didn't hear it? It was somebody, Donald somebody. Sharia is totalitarianism, but with a God. Weak pins and mighty swords. This brave British cartoonist draws anti-Semitic images of Jews and the Jewish state. This shows that he enjoys being free. But he would never draw a cartoon about Muhammad. That shows that he enjoys being alive. That's real Islamophobia. The Islamophobia you hear about from CARE is an intimidation that's used to try to get people to not speak out against Islam. And they're saying, oh, you're afraid, you're afraid. But the people who will not draw a cartoon of Muhammad are the ones who are actually in fear of Islam. That's real Islamophobia. And as he said earlier, we need to speak out, stand up and speak out and not be afraid. All right, anti-Israel is the new anti-Semitism. This is point number 2. Anti-Semitism in 2015 is against Israel and the people of the book. I'll talk about that a little more, but you know the phrase that little Satan and the great Satan. Israel is the little Satan, U.S. is the great Satan. Anti-Semitism used to be personal, but now it's against the state. They say, I'm not against the Jews, just the occupation. And so they say, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just against Israel because they're occupying. Well, a person who says that virtually always ends up conflating the two, and they don't make a distinction. It is Jews that they don't like, as well as the state of Israel. And, by the way, they're wrong about the occupation. The occupation narrative is false. By international law, Israel is not occupying the West Bank. They're actually not. This land was given to Israel under the UN partition plan. When the Arabs refused their part, they're the ones who changed the deal. And then Jordan came in and for 19 years, from 48 to 67, occupied the West Bank. And then in the 67 war, Israel defeated the 5 Arab nations that were against them. And then Israel then ruled and began ruling the West Bank area, which is really Judea and Samaria in the Bible. And so even by international law, they're not occupying, and yet all the narrative is they're occupiers. So that's something you can straighten out if you talk to somebody. There's a saying in the Middle East, you might have heard this, first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. That's a widespread saying among the jihadists and the radicals. They aren't going just for Jews anymore. And Dr. Harris is going to be expanding on that about Christian persecution. And part of what I want to do tonight is to kind of set the stage for Dr. Harris because there is a connection between Jews and Christians because of the Bible, because we worship the same God. We don't worship different gods. We worship the same God. And it's very important that we understand that. Here's a picture that's kind of chilling. An Israeli flag with a Nazi swastika. And look at the quote by Martin Luther King Jr. When people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism. Here's a quote from my new book, Blessing Israel, chapter 6. The title of the chapter is Christian Anti-Semitism is an Oxymoron. Christian anti-Semitism is an oxymoron. If you're a Bible-believing Christian, you can't be anti-Semitic and be consistent with the Bible. I'd like to read this quote. The BDS movement. How many of you have heard of the BDS movement? Raise your hand, yeah. Not quite half, okay. Well, there's a worldwide activist movement called BDS for boycott, divest, and sanction. They demand that individuals and even nations adopt their program against Israel. It has become quite popular, especially in Europe, the Muslim world, of course, and college campuses, right here in the U.S. It is in vogue to show that you are a progressive insider in the know. Fortunately, there is a counter movement appealing for support of Israel, but the lines are being drawn, and this is one issue in which you do not want to be on the wrong side of history. The tragic irony for those who know their history is that the BDS movement is precisely what happened in pre-war Germany in the 1930s. Only then it was directed at the Jews personally, eventually characterizing them as vermin that must be exterminated. Now, with the new and improved version, they do not hate Jews. Heaven forbid, that would be racist. They simply object to Israel. The eventual outcome of this trajectory will be the elimination of Israel as the only final solution. It is already stated directly in the charters of the PLO, Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, many other terrorist groups. It's also in the stated aim of sovereign nations like Iran and Syria, Sudan, Yemen, and you could go on, many other Muslim nations. If it's not in their charters, they're not far from it. Here's another cartoon. This is Hitler in Hell. Is the title of this one. Great news, Adolf. Your Nazi program to boycott, divest, and bring crushing sanctions against the Jews has been revived and repackaged for sale in the 21st century. It's now called BDS. Hitler says, cool. And the demon says, that's a word we don't use down here. Well, there's been an awful lot of violence, and it's increasing. And in Europe, Jewish leaders are warning in many places that in their communities are questioning whether they have any future in the region. This shows a cemetery that's vandalized. I think it's a very gripping picture. And it says Jewish communities around the world saw an explosion of hatred last year, this is 2014, with the number of violent anti-Semitic attacks rising by 38% in 1 year over 2013. A report by researchers at Tel Aviv University recorded 766 incidents in 2014, ranging from armed assaults to vandalism against synagogues, schools, and cemeteries, compared to 554 in 2013. I could give you statistics. I could talk. I have enough material to bore you to death. But I think we understand that it is on the rise. I just want to give some examples. Here's one from May 2015. And the Paris mayor condemns anti-Semitism. She says disguised in anti-Zionism. So she gets it. She understands what I'm saying. She's speaking at a global forum for combating anti-Semitism. May 2015, anti-Semitic attack on a Jewish mother near Paris. 3 men attacked a Jewish woman in a Parisian suburb, yelling dirty race, and Hitler didn't finish the job. June 2015, a Belgian cop writes on Facebook, I would kill each and every Jew. July, Jewish boy beaten and robbed in Paris, anti-Semitic attack, 13-year-old. The hospital after 6 men beat and yell, take that dirty Jew, and steal his phone. 6. Go there yet. September, in Britain, 17-year-old beaten unconscious in an anti-Semitic attack. October, UNESCO, that's just last week, claims the Cave of Patriarchs in Hebron and Rachel's tomb on the edge of Bethlehem, between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, as Muslim holy sites by UNESCO. And I don't know if you heard just recently, there's a report of Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, who has been on record as inciting the violence that's now going on in Israel, the stabbing attacks and so forth. He's on a video where he's actually saying he vows to stop the filthy feet of Jews from stepping foot on the Temple Mount. The filthy feet of Jews. And he's the one Israel's supposed to make peace with. This is something, if you haven't seen this, hopefully I'll be able to play this. Maybe not. Well, I don't seem to be able to find the little thing to start playing it. You might have seen this on the news. It's been on the news. A little, about 4-year-old girl being coached by her father, holding a great big butcher knife, saying, "I want to kill Jews." And he says, "Well, how do you want to kill them?" She says, "With a knife." And he's coaching her through this. And that's actually a normal thing. There was a baby that's just been named in Gaza called Knife of Jerusalem. That's the name given to the new baby. Probably not a name you're thinking of for your grandchild. It's already a baby. I'm telling you, you can't make this stuff up. So why do people hate the Jews? Why does the world hate the Jews? Well, they're God's chosen people. That's one of the main reasons. You can list a lot of other things, but it really, I think, comes down to that one. There's a poignant line in the movie Fiddler on the Roof. "I know we Jews are your chosen people, but just once in a while, couldn't you choose someone else?" And it's because God has chosen Israel. And look at the scripture. This goes all the way back to Genesis 12. "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." God's original purpose in creating Israel was to use them as a vehicle to bless all the nations, to bless all the world. But the world instead resented that he had favored them. And it's kind of like the story of Joseph, where his brothers saw that Joseph was being favored by their father, and they threw Joseph in a pit and sold him into slavery. And it took a real miracle to turn it all around and save the Jewish people in that day. So, blessing, it's not only that God blesses Israel or chooses Israel, but why? So that they can be a blessing to the whole earth. You've probably seen the list of all the Nobel Prize winners, the long list of Jewish Nobel Prize winners, and the short list of Muslims, in spite of 1.5 billion Muslims in the world and so forth. And of course, you know about the technology and the medicine and all of our phones, our chips in our phones, and just on and on and on. The contributions Israel is continuing to make. The blessing. God is favoring Israel. They have just recently discovered trillions of cubic feet of natural gas off the coast of Haifa. They've just discovered massive amounts of oil near the Golan Heights. Interesting location. Especially today, I think it was, that Russia was actually bombing right near the Golan Heights, right, very close to the Israeli border with their planes. This is not a good time to take a break. This is a time to pay attention to what's going on. Don't fall asleep. All right, here's another scripture. This is kind of a core scripture for me. It's a prophecy in Psalms. It's Psalm 83. The first 5 verses is what I want to focus on, but it describes a war that I believe is actually about to take place. It's about to culminate. It actually names the countries in Psalm 83. But look at what the writer of the Psalms, who he attributes as the target here. You see the part that I've emphasized. Do not keep silent, O God. Do not hold your peace. And do not be still, O God, for behold, your enemies. This is talking to God, saying, God, your enemies make a tumult. Those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people, and consulted together against your sheltered ones. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. For they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy, not a union, by the way, a confederacy against you. It's against God. The rebellion of man has always been against God. And that's what's going on with Islam today. This is Prime Minister Netanyahu saying a new Amalek is appearing and once again threatening to annihilate the Jews. He's referring to the Amalekites back in Samuel's day, one of the biggest enemies of Israel. And he's identifying in this particular timing, he's actually referring to Iran, but it could apply to all of the radical Muslims, Islamists, because they're threatening to annihilate the Jews. All of those terrorist groups I mentioned before are all threatening to do that, but so are the nations, including Iran. We've all heard Iran quote, even just in recent news, and right in the context of this deal that President Obama made with Iran, they're still saying, we're going to destroy Israel. We're going to destroy Israel. It's the same ancient hatred that is still against Israel. Why? Because they hate God. It's a different God. Okay? All right. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about the Holocaust song. I could skip for an easy, comfortable hour on this one song. This is Psalm 102. You got to make a note of that and read it later. The first 10 verses of Psalm 102, in my view, are a graphic description of the Holocaust. I mean, once you see that, it's just overwhelming. And in fact, later in the psalm it says this is written for a generation to come. Actually, the Hebrew text there in verse 18 is this shall be written for the generation last. Dor Acharon is the Hebrew, which is generation last. That song didn't make a lot of sense. It was kind of generally comforting, up until 1945. But after 1945, we understood what that song said because of the picture. And actually, it talks about, I mingled ashes with my bread. What else could they be talking about but the crematoriums and the concentration camps? You need to read Psalm 102, first 10 verses. And then I want to zero in on verses 12 and 13. But you, O Jehovah, shall endure forever, and the remembrance of your name to all generations. God is actually in the process of restoring the use of his personal name instead of the generic Lord or generic God. Yeah. You will arise and have mercy on Zion, for the time to favor her. Yes, the set time has come. So if those first 10 verses are the Holocaust, and in 1948, Israel became a nation, and God had been prospering and blessing and building up Israel ever since, I think we can see where we are prophetically in this song. And so I just give that to you. That's the Cliff Notes version. All right, so what are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? My fourth point, action. Well, I think it's all or nothing. I don't think there's any middle ground available anymore. We see that in politics. We see it in our country, so divided and so forth. There's a reason. There's a reason. God's not surprised. Can you picture God up in heaven saying, oh no, what am I going to do? I didn't see this coming. He knows what's going on. And we know how it's going to end up, too. Well, action is all or nothing. And as I said, I quoted Genesis 12. You can bless Israel or you can curse Israel. And whichever one you do, you'll get a response from God. The antidote to anti-Semitism is biblical Zionism. Bless Israel. That's the best thing you can do. I say biblical Zionism, and I said earlier I call myself a Christian Zionist, but biblical Zionism applies to Christians and Jews, and for that matter, anybody else who wants to adopt the Bible as their rule for faith and practice. Because the God of the Bible actually is a Zionist. I don't know if you knew that or not. Now, Jews and Christians are merging, and I'm not sure how I'm doing on my time here, but I'm coming to the end. Kind of lead in now to Dr. Harris. One of the things that I see is that Jews and Christians, now when I say that I have to say Bible-believing Jews, or Jews who are paying attention, and Christians who believe their Bibles, and Christians who are paying attention. There's a lot of Christendom out there that is blind as a bat and doesn't have a clue what's going on. And that's true also of Jews. It's time to wake up. It's time for us to realize we're each other's best friends. We need to stand together here. Now, I want to show you some other suggestions for what we can do and how we can follow through on this. Develop closer relationships with each other. I'm talking about Jews and Christians. Offer availability for each other's needs. You know, how come people like Corrie ten Boom and other so-called righteous Gentiles of the nations, how come they risked their lives to save Jews in Nazi Germany? There was something relational already going on. It wasn't a theological thing. Not too many people will die for their theology, but they'll die for relationships. So we need to build relationships between Jews and Christians. We need to stand up to and defend insults and attacks on each other. We need to contact media to correct misinformation. I think it might have been Mark Twain who said, if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you're misinformed. Well, most people are either uninformed or misinformed, and we need to inform them. We can do that. If you just know what you're talking about. Contact your representatives regularly. Speak truth every time a lie is spoken. Don't let somebody speak a lie. They're just repeating something they heard on the news or somewhere. And then it's hanging out there in the air. Say something. Say, that's not true. And tell the truth. Use social media, especially Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn to speak the truth. We better catch on to that. I love the little story about just kind of a little anecdote, I guess. It's the time when the Messiah finally arrives in Jerusalem. And the mayor, soon it would be Mayor Barkov, goes out to meet the Messiah and he says, "Welcome, we have waited for you for so long. I just have one question. Is this your first or second visit?" Then everything will be satisfied. All right. Well, the antidote to anti-Israel libel and propaganda is to be unashamedly pro-Israel biblical Zionists. Both Jews and Christians are best prepared for this task because it is a heart issue for us. Institutional religion has other goals. Politicians have other agendas. Now is the time for passionate biblical Zionists to stand up and be counted and be heard trumpeting God's agenda. That is the only winning side in the end. It is the right side of history. If you're a scripture believer, whether Jew or Christian, it's time to step up and proclaim yourself a biblical Zionist. The number one Zionist is Jehovah God himself. And if God is for us, who can stand against us? Amen? Where there is apathy, speak knowledge. Where there is indifference, show care and love. Where there is denial, proclaim truth. It's time to break radio silence, saddle up, and turn our plowshares into swords. Amen. I think I got that scripture backwards because the verse at the United Nations says you'll turn your swords into plowshares. But there's a verse in Joel that is actually more appropriate for where we are in history today. And it says it's time to turn your plowshares into swords. Yes. Amen. All right, this is my segue now to Dr. Harris. This is a Christian clergyman who says the silence of Christian leaders in the face of an Islamic war to destroy the Jewish state is not anti-Semitic. After all, we are equally silent about Islamic attacks against Christians. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate you.
This is fabulous. I am so honored to be here. I'm so thankful for Jamie's invitation and this incredible group of Icon. And I've heard so much about this group and about what is happening down here in this part of North Carolina. And it is exciting. And I'm so thankful for Les and for just hearing tonight what phenomenal insights and wisdom and understanding and discernment that God has given this man. And I know many of you in this area have certainly been blessed by his ministry and by his work. And You know, as he was talking and sharing with the anti-Semitism, I'll take just a moment. When I stood in the pulpit at First Baptist Church, Charlotte, this past Sunday, I shared with our people, I said, you know, on the way to church this morning, I was trying to think where I was this time last week. And I immediately knew where I was. You see, it was that Sunday morning that I was feverishly trying to call in to our service, where I was going to speak to our 8 o'clock service that morning. And then at 10:30, again, I was trying feverishly to get my phone to work and to call in. Because I would have been calling in to both of those services from a hospital in the hills of Israel, where I had just had the opportunity to meet and spend time with 2 teenage young men, a third in surgery, and to spend time with 3 children under the age of 10 years old, who had all been severely injured in the civil war in Syria. They had made their way to the border. Compassionate Israeli soldiers had brought them for treatment to this hospital. This hospital has treated more than 547 of the very people who have declared their desire to kill these folks, called Jews. It's really amazing. From the day after the Declaration of Independence was made in Israel, they were told, we hope you can swim, because we will not stop until we have driven every one of you into the Mediterranean Sea and drowned. It's 2015, folks, and they still live with that threat every single day. And we have a nation and an administration that, I'm sorry to say, has taken their hands off and said, you're on your own in so many ways. And that vacuum of leadership that has now been left in the Middle East has caused, well, what we know is happening around the world. Our allies no longer believe they can trust us. And our enemies fully believe they can take advantage of us. Enter the room Vladimir Putin, who has taken this opportunity to fill a vacuum of leadership in the Middle East that our president and administration has deeply left. I'm so thankful for the action steps and the things that Les shared tonight, and how critically important it is for all of us to stand with Israel and to stand particularly in this very, very difficult time. They are our ally. They are our friend. And I'm reminded oftentimes of something that a preacher I heard said many, many years ago. He grew up in a neighborhood filled with Italians and Jews. And he was Italian, and he had a Jewish best friend. And he said, you know, say what you want to, they really are brighter folks. He said, in fact, every day when we would get ready to go to school, our friend's mom would always say, don't forget your books. My mom, the Italian, would always say, don't forget your lunch. And sure enough, he said the truth has been played out time and time again. Tonight, I have the assignment to share with you for the next few minutes about this issue. When I was first called, we talked about sharing a little bit about the issue of religious freedom here in America, a subject that is obviously near and dear to my heart, and I know near and dear to many of your hearts. And then, of course, as we continue to think about this idea of persecution that has happened not only to Jews, but an incredible segue, as Les said, we see things that are happening to Christians all around the world. But I want to tie together for you something and tell you briefly a little story that I think will help you understand the real issue and the real problem about persecution of Christians that we not only see happening around the world, but that has now come to our shores and is happening in unique ways that many folks are falling asleep at the wheel and not recognizing exactly what's taking place. It was the summer of 2013 that First Baptist Church Charlotte had entered into our second year of a partnership, a mission partnership with the country over in the country of Serbia. Serbia, as you may be familiar, is part of that chopped up country that used to be Yugoslavia. And Serbia possessed the area or possessed a group of people that were known as the Roma people. And the Roma were those that have some great needs. As the gypsies, in many ways, they're not accepted in the culture, not accepted in the society. And as we learned more about them at First Baptist Church Charlotte, we decided that was the people group we wanted to adopt, that we wanted to reach. And so we put a strategy together, and we found, we traveled over there. I traveled with a team. We identified a gypsy village, and we decided that our strategy was going to be to do a children's camp over there. We would reach the children that would then open the door to reach the parents and be able to share and so forth. And our ultimate goal was to be able, quite frankly, to plant a church in this area called Vaiska, which was the name of this town that had this incredible Roma population, including the school. In fact, when we were on our fact-finding mission, how shocked I was as I was walking down a village one day with a couple of our folks that were with us. There were about 5 on our team. And a young lady walked up to me, and her English was pretty good, frankly, and she said, Are you from America? And I said, well, yes. And she said, do you know Samaritan's Purse? And I said, well, absolutely. I said, in fact, I'm from Charlotte in America, and we've got a team from here, and we know Samaritan's Purse quite well. And I said, how do you know Samaritan's Purse? And she began to say that she was a teacher at the elementary school that was right up there from our village. And how Samaritan's Purse had come and distributed the shoe boxes and Operation Christmas Child to many of those Roma children. And well, it didn't take me long. God didn't have to hit me upside the head with a 2x4 to know this is the village where we're supposed to be. And so we had planned out our strategy. So it's the summer of 2013. We bring 28 people from our church to go and do this mission project. We had found a park. We had been told it would be great. We could meet in this park. Well, the first day we meet in the park, we get introduced, I'll say, to the authorities. And the authorities there in that park across the street invited us in a very unique way that we needed to come and sit down with the mayor of that community, and we needed to get a permit. Well, we went and we sat down with the mayor. Everything got put on hold. Here we had nearly 100 Roman children that were coming to the camp, and here we had 28 folks, and now we're being told we got to get a permit. And so we go to get this permit, and they said, what are you doing? We said, look, we're wanting to reach these children and teach them and care for them. Well, what are you going to be doing? Well, we're going to run it like a backyard Bible school that many of you have worked in probably in your life. We're going to have some music, and one group will come for music, and then we're going to have crafts, and there'll be another group in crafts, and then we're going to have recreation. There'll be another group in recreation, and then we're going to have a Bible story, and we'll read to them from the Bible. The mayor, Orthodox, pastor, and the others there and the officials looked at us and said, we will give you your permit, but under these conditions. It is fine to do music. It is fine for you to do recreation. It's fine for you to make crafts. But you cannot read the Bible in this park. This is a public park. You cannot read the Bible here. Well, what do we do? I mean, we've come, and I asked him, we've come through a translator. We've come all the way. We're wanting to reach these kids. this is what we do. He said, the Bible can only be read inside. We found a building that we had rented about 100 yards away, football field and a half, probably 150 yards away. And so let's just say I had the blue team, if you will, when we broke the kids up into the 4 groups. So whenever it was time for my group to have the Bible story, we would hike 150 yards into the building that we had then rented where the children could hear a Bible story, and then they would come back. That's Serbia. That's Eastern Europe after the fall of communism. In fact, I'll never forget, as I talked to one of our translators there on the ground who was a Christian, and I said, help me understand, what was life like here under Tito, your communist dictator, as far as your faith and your religion is concerned? They said, oh, Tito was very good. Well, you don't expect to hear in Eastern Europe the same term, very good, and a communist dictator in the same sentence. But Tito was unique, and if any of you know that history, you know that he was one of those guys that kind of played the Soviet Union on one side and played the West on the other, and he was quite sharp at that. And Tito convinced the people in Yugoslavia they had religious freedom. And this man who was a Christian with pioneer missions looked at me and said, he'd even been in Tito's army because he was required to as an 18-year-old. He looked at me and said, yes, we have religious freedom. Tito was good. We just had to keep everything we did within the 4 walls of the church. And we were free to do whatever we wanted to do. And I said to this man, his name was Yarko, I said, Yarko, that's not religious freedom. Fast forward. It's 2015. I've just learned a week earlier that the city of Charlotte, our city council, has taken up a non-discrimination act expansion that is similar to that that's been passed in Houston and other major cities around the nation. And they were about to vote on this non-discrimination act that for the first time in history would make a protected class out of people based on how they express themselves sexually. And not only that, as part of this non-discrimination ordinance, it became known as the bathroom bill because it basically said, and I've read a lot of legislation, and I've read a lot of ordinances in my life, but this was the first time I had read something that said that a man could go into a woman's bathroom or a woman could go to a man's bathroom if they felt a certain way on that. They didn't have to even present themselves. A male who was transgender to female didn't even have to present as a female. He could go into a female bathroom under this ordinance. There was a lot of organization that took place in the city of Charlotte, and a lot of believers got together. And I'm just going to tell you, if you haven't heard the story, you need to hear it sometime. I don't have time to tell it to you tonight. It was an act of God, but that got defeated 6-5 that night. Don't clap too soon. Here's the deal. On the vote was to happen on Monday night. On Saturday, I got a call from one of the city council members who happened to be running for mayor this time. And he had actually gotten a letter from me. We had put together a thing where you could sign a petition, and if you signed the petition, it fired off a letter to every single city council member. And these folks were overwhelmed. Our city council members got over 8,000 emails to each of their email addresses opposing this. And they were getting this kind of information. Well, he managed to track mine down and sent me an email and asked me if I would mind sharing my phone number with him. He'd like to talk to me, and he calls me on Saturday night. Never talked to this man in my life. And he said, Mark, I want to just share with you a little bit about this thing coming up Monday night. And he said, I think I kind of have a compromise. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, Mark, you and I believe the same thing in a lot of ways. And he said, and he was a Democrat, and he said, but I'm going to make a motion to take the transgender bathroom aspect out of it. I just wondered how you'd feel about that. And I said, well, I appreciate your call and I appreciate your concern and I appreciate your willingness to see what the point we've been making about the dangers here. But please understand that's not going to work. Because the other part of that ordinance that was going to make a protected class out of a group of people purely based on how they express themselves sexually, that's even more dangerous than the transgender bathroom aspect. Because now you're starting to talk about what you're going to do to people in my church that own businesses that want to be able to carry the convictions of their heart into their businesses. And so, no, I appreciate your willingness to offer that, but I can't support that. Here's what he said. It blew my mind. He said, Mark, don't you understand? Mark, you are already protected under the First Amendment. You have the freedom of worship. He said, you have the freedom of worship. You can worship any way you want to in your church house or in your house. But it can't go beyond that. Well, the first thing we did in that conversation is had a brief understanding that in that First Amendment of the Constitution, I'm not guaranteed the freedom of worship. I'm guaranteed the freedom of religion. And there's a big difference. You see, they want to use that terminology, and they've been selling it from the White House down to the city councils and the mayors across this nation, where they've been trying to win this battle, and they've been saying, tell people they have freedom of worship, because if it's only about worship, then it's going to be limited to being in the church house or in your house. But our founding fathers intended that because these Judeo-Christian principles were going to be foundational in our country, you and I shouldn't have to check our faith at the door of the church. We ought to be able, as every American, to live and work in a way that's consistent with our faith. That's what it means. Every American able to live and work in a way that is consistent with their faith. That's all this is about. And you and I must understand that after this gentleman and I talked about the Constitution, I then said, Dave, well, I wouldn't give his name. I called his name, and I said, can I explain to you what happened to me in Serbia 2 years ago? And I said, if what you're telling me is true, sir, in summer of 2015 or summer of 2016, when we're having vacation Bible school at First Baptist Church of Charlotte, and it's a beautiful, starry, warm June evening, and I want to take our kids out to Marshall Park, and I want to have the Bible story in Marshall Park, according to what you just said to me, that would not fly in your world of government. We've got to wake up and realize this issue of religious freedom is far more important than we are understanding it to be. We need to awaken and see what's happening. I have a favorite passage that God laid on my heart several years ago, and it's burned my heart. It comes out of Nehemiah. If you know anything about that book, you know that Nehemiah found out what was happening in his homeland, and it broke his heart. By the time you get to chapter 2, he's made his way back to Jerusalem, and he is now prayer walking around the city. And you know what he found out? It was far worse than he ever thought it was told it was going to be. It was bad. The Bible says he was so brokenhearted over what had happened to his homeland that he wept and he wept and he wept. And then when he finished that he couldn't cry any more tears, it was at that point God gave Nehemiah the vision for what had to happen around Jerusalem. This is historical fact. And as you picture in the 17th verse of the 2nd chapter, Nehemiah gathers all the Jews there in Jerusalem, and he looks at them and he says, you see the distress that we are in. How the walls are broken down and how the gates are burned with fire. Come and let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a reproach. Or a great translation of that is no longer be an embarrassment. Because you see, the great city of God, for 142 years with those walls down, had become a place where thieves and foreign invaders came in and out at will and raped and pillaged the land. And God gave Nehemiah the vision. What was his vision? Same vision that you and I better wake up and see. See, number one is he said, you better recognize the emergency that we're in. See, when he said, look around you and see the distress that we're in, those particular folks, it had been 142 years. If you consider a generation 40 years, 3.5 generations had passed. People had become desensitized. They had come to accept the, quote, new norm, and they just didn't think anything was ever going to get any better. Nehemiah had to wake them up to recognize the emergency that they were in. I'm saying to you tonight, I have put in your possession on your chairs 2 books that are yours to take home tonight, and I hope you'll take them. They're gifts to you from the Family Research Council in Washington, D.C. These read like a diary. And I'll tell you why these 2 I put in your hands tonight. One of them is called The Clear and Present Danger. And as you start on the first page, and you'll see a letter from General Boykin and Tony Perkins, retired general, I should say, Jerry Boykin, and you flip all the way over to the back and you see all the footnotes and endnotes, you will read section by section, dates and times where things have happened in our military to remove God from the United States military. There is something going on in our U.S. military tonight that is inflicting harm on religious freedom, the likes of which so many people are not aware. I was so impressed the first time I read this. I ordered enough copies for this that every family at First Baptist Church Charlotte left church on the weekend of July 4th with a copy of this in their hand. And I encourage every one of them to go and read it from cover to cover. But it will cause you to lose sleep at night when you stop and think of the risks that are being taken by removing God from our military. The second one I put in your hand here is called Hostility to Religion. It's a red, white, and blue one I'm called. The growing threat to religious liberty in the United States. Again, it reads like a diary. And as you read that, you will understand case by case, situation by situation, where business owners are now being handcuffed and told that they've got to check their convictions at the door of their church. They can no longer carry them out into the workplace. They just can't. And to do so means that you're going to be fined or imprisoned or both. That's the case if you look on page 30. And you find that cake artist undergoes rehabilitation for refusing to bake cake for same-sex wedding. How many of you here have heard of Melissa and Aaron Klein? Raise your hand. Many of you have heard the story of the Kleins, who have lost everything, closing their business because of the situation they were facing, being forced to bake a cake for a same-sex ceremony that just didn't match up with their convictions. But they were told by a judge that was part of the duty of citizenship. What? Oh yeah. You'd be fascinated to read the opinions. How many of you here have heard of Baronelle Stutzman? Raise your hand. Some of you not as many. Baronelle Stutzman. Baronelle is the florist. She's the one that you may recall that had served in her florist for several years. That she had a great relationship with a man that bought flowers from her for years. And their relationship was so great that he came to her one day and she knew that he was going homosexual. She had no hatred in her heart toward him whatsoever. And so much was their relationship that he said, Barronelle, I'm going to get married. It's now legal and I'm going to get married and I want you to do the flowers for my wedding. Barronelle Stutzman told him, she said, no, listen. She said, I can't do it. Because my faith and my beliefs just don't go along with that. And she, in fact, gave him the names of 3 or 4 other florists that wouldn't be an issue with. Great florists. And she said, I cared for him. And I didn't want him just to go out and get anybody to do his flowers. She wanted a quality florist. They embraced before he left the store. But there was an agenda in this nation and an aggressive attorney general who talked those 2 men into filing suit against Barronelle Stutzman. Today, she not only has lost her business, but stands to lose her home. When the Attorney General of that state said to her, listen, we'll forget all of this. If you'll just commit, you'll never turn down an order again based on your beliefs. She said, I can't do that. I can't do that. She's lost everything. How many of y'all have heard of Coach Joe Kennedy? Some of you may not have heard that one because that's just happening now. Joe Kennedy's there in the state of Washington. For all these years as football coach, he's been going to the 50-yard line at the end of the game and kneeling down and praying. Until the superintendent of schools said, you can't do that anymore. What? And Joe at first, quite frankly, kind of backed off. I mean, everybody's got to decide what they're going to do in that situation. And he backed off, but he couldn't do it long. I mean, because for all these years he had been doing it, when Joe went out by himself, he never invited anybody to come with him, but some of his players just naturally came and they knelt down of their own volition. Now he's being told by the school superintendent, you can't do that anymore. Now, if you don't think it gets crazier, this past Friday night, all eyes were on Joe. And at the end of the game, by the way, let me stop before I get to the end of the game. Joe had told his players, I know you guys, I know you love me, but don't come out on that field. For your own good, the good of everybody, I'm asking you. In fact, at the end of the game, when Joe Kennedy went to kneel down on the 50-yard line to do what he had been doing for years and pray once again, he would say he began to feel other people coming around him. And honestly, he began to pray, oh, God, don't let that be my players. Please don't let that be my players. It wasn't. It was the opposing team. Their players and their players had gathered at the 50-yard line with Joe Kennedy to pray. This is Tuesday night. I was pretty excited Sunday night when the Panthers won and are now 6-0. But that excitement pales in comparison to the excitement I have for what's going to happen this Friday night to Coach Joe Kennedy, who is demonstrating the courage of religious freedom and what it's all about. You see, that's what Nehemiah was trying to get people to see. As you may say, it's not affecting me. Just give it a little time. It's coming to you. Listen, when I'd go up to Hickory, I'd go up to other places and share what we were going through down there in Charlotte with the non-discrimination ordinance and all that stuff. They'd look at me like I had 2 heads. And they would say, nothing like that's ever going to happen in Yadkin County or Catawba County and Hickory. I said, you just wait. It's like dominoes. They fall one at a time. And there's a reason that they start in Charlotte and Raleigh and Greensboro and Winston-Salem and Wilmington and Asheville. There's a reason they start there. And they spread. Nehemiah said, you see the distress that we are in. I say, we better recognize the emergency. By the way, Nehemiah then told them in verse 18, he said, I told them of the hand of my God which was good upon me, and the king's words that he had spoken for me. And what that says, and I'm a Christian, y'all know that, just means that we're not only going to have to recognize the emergency, we're in a situation in our nation where we're going to have to rely upon God's power to move once again. That's what Nehemiah said. Have you ever stopped and just used your head for a moment to think about how weird it was that Nehemiah was the guy used in this big building project? Nehemiah's job, in case you didn't know, he was cupbearer to the king. That was the cushiest job in the world. Seriously, he lived in the palace. He tasted some food. It didn't get any cushier than that. Cupbearer to the king. If you would have gone to shake Nehemiah's hands, there would have been a callus on those hands. They would have been the softest hands you ever would have touched. Nehemiah didn't have a clue how to pull a plumb line. Nehemiah didn't have a clue how to lay a brick. He didn't have a clue how to mix mortar. And this is the guy God would choose? He did it for one reason. Because his hand was on Nehemiah's life. And that was what it was going to take to pull out of the tragedy they were in. We need to recognize the emergency. We need to rely upon God, His power. But then I'll say this as I close. We've got to be relentless in our efforts. We got to do something. We got to take some action. So, Mark, what kind of action do you think it's going to take to turn the tide? I'll tell you, I got a few ideas. For one, I think we've got to be relentless by, number one, let's be conspicuous. It's time to step up. It's time that we're no longer ashamed of what we believe. It's time that we're no longer backed into a corner, but that we're willing to stand for truth, stand for something, believe something, and have some guts and a backbone to stand and defend it. Be conspicuous. I'm sick and tired of seeing conservatives on any station. I don't care if it's Fox or CNN. We get in a debate and we shrink back to the defensive. We need to get on offense. And we need to be speaking truth about the realities of what's going on in our culture. Yes. Be conspicuous. I've said to the church, one of the things we're doing is we are introducing all across North Carolina culture impact teams. If you don't know anything about this, I want you to see me tonight. In fact, if you'd ever be interested in having a culture impact team in your church, you say, Mark, we can't have a culture impact team in my church. You tell me why not. I don't know what kind of church or parish you may go to, but I assume that probably where you go, if you're like just about any denomination I've run across, you got a missions committee, you got a finance committee, you got a personnel committee, we got a committee for everything. Why do we not have a culture impact committee? And you say, well, what does a culture impact committee do? 4 simple things. Inform the congregation, equip the congregation, alert the congregation, and yes, there will be times that we have to mobilize the congregation and show up. Show up at the school board meeting. Show up at the county commission meeting. I can say this because I didn't get elected. But there's a lot of politicians, and there's a lot of politicians who don't do much very well. But one thing I have found 100% of them can do with excellence. They can count. And they can sit in a meeting and they can count noses of who's for and who's against. And as sad as and unfortunate as it is, we've got to be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves and know that they can count. And it's time for us to show up and be counted. Be conspicuous. We now have 300 churches across North Carolina who have culture impact teams, who have been trained and are now informing, equipping, alerting, and mobilizing their congregation. It's how we turned out hundreds and hundreds of people in Charlotte on the backroom ordinance. Because you've got to be able to have a network to step up and step out. Be conspicuous. I would say to you, secondly, we've got to be consistent. We can't just back up. This is what thrills me so much about this organization. This is what thrills me about this crowd on a Tuesday night. Because we can't just wait around until 6 weeks before the election and do something. We've got to be learning now. We've got to be meeting now. We've got to be pulling together now to get ready for what's ahead. Oh, listen. Be consistent. And then I'll say lastly, be courageous. I was so blessed when I saw these orange ribbons. Because next to this orange ribbon is a lapel pin that I'm wearing. It changed my life in May of this year. So how's a lapel pin change your life? This simple. I was in Washington, D.C. attending a Watchman on the Wall conference. On Friday night, Dr. Tony Perkins, president of the FRC, stood and shared that night about a situation several weeks earlier when he, along with 6 other men, had gathered at Jerry Boykin's home. He had invited these 7 men, 6 and 7 counting General Boykin, 7 of them together for dinner. Among that 7 was Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Lieutenant Colonel North had just returned from Erbil, where while he was there, if you know anything about Erbil, it's under control of the Kurds. And while he was there, they managed to capture 2 ISIS fighters. 2 ISIS fighters they captured had all kinds of video material, DVDs, and all that stuff on. One of the DVDs they had there, Lieutenant Colonel North made a copy and brought it back. And after dinner, those 7 men retired to the den to watch that DVD, of which Tony Perkins said made him physically ill. Why? We all have heard and know that when ISIS goes into a village, Christians, they knock on the door. As any great military group would do, you clear the area. And so they go house by house, and family comes to the door, Christian family. And the ISIS fighters bring them up to speed and let them know that their ISIS, the Islamic State, has taken over that village. And they want to let them know that they have several options in how we're going to do business. Option number 1 is that you can recant your faith in Jesus Christ and you can convert to Islam. You can bow down to Muhammad and convert. Now, you don't have to do that. We do have a second option. We put in place an Islamic State tax that you can pay. But the reality is that they've set that tax so high that they know that if every person in that village pooled their money together, there wouldn't be enough to pay for one family. Or then you have option number 3, they say. We execute you. We'll be back, they say. On that video, they turn and they go to the Jeep, and out of their Jeep, they pull a can of black spray paint. And with that can of black spray paint, They go to the front of that house, and this symbol I'm wearing on my lapel pin is sprayed on the front and the side of that house. You say, what is that, Mark? That symbol? It's the word Nazarene. Every ISIS fighter will know that every house with this symbol on it, you take your smartphone, you Google Arabic, Nazarene, this is what you'll find. It'll come up on your smartphone. They finished that, and they went and they put the paint back in the Jeep. And on that DVD that those men watched that night, they saw as this man goes back in the house and he brings out his family. As they're coming out, there's an ISIS fighter who takes what appears to be a white stake, piece of a picket fence it even appears to be, and he's driving it in the ground with a sledgehammer. And then on that video, with that family lined up against the wall, front wall of that house, as tradition would have it, they start with the youngest child first. They took that child out of the arms of their mother, and they impaled that baby on that stake. The mother, so distraught, screams and leaves that wall running toward the stake, where two ISIS fighters grab her and cut off both of her arms. And she falls down, bleeding to death, unable to ever put her arms around her baby again. All of this transpires, as you can see in the corner of the screen. The Father is being crucified and forced to watch his family go through this. When I left the ballroom of that hotel that night, I was by myself. I went upstairs to my room, and I'm just going to tell you straight up, God and I had some kind of time together that I had not had with Him in years. That night, I got down by my bed and I cried out, Dear God, God, I don't understand this. I don't get this. God, that little family lived through that kind of persecution for one reason and one reason alone. They refused to recant their faith in you. God, I don't get that. I don't get why I'm here in the safety of this hotel room in Washington, D.C., and they're over there. I don't get why they aren't sitting where I am and why I'm not over there facing what they're facing. I don't get that. Anybody that's known me for any length of time knows that, you may have heard me tell, when I was 11 years old, I got a Jesus First pin that I've been wearing on my lapel since I was 11. I gave my heart and life to Jesus Christ when I was 10. A year later, I was watching at 7 o'clock on Sunday morning the Old Time Gospel Hour. Jerry Falwell held up 2 pens and said, if you'll write me, I'll send you 2 of these free. Well, even as an 11-year-old, I knew a good deal when I saw it. So I wrote him, and Falwell sent me 2 of those pens, and I lost one of them along the way, but one of them I've held on to, and to this day, I'm worn Jesus First. In fact, when I ran for the United States Senate, people asked me, you going to take that off when you run for the Senate? I said, why would I take that off? I mean, seriously. I can represent everybody, but listen, if I need Jesus to be first in my life now, if I get elected, I really need Him to be first in my life. And the people need Him to be first. No, I'm not going to take it off. I remember Bill O'Neill, a reporter, WXI, on our plane landing in Greensboro on the day of our announcement. He was offended by that. He got he was with the media, and I remember he put that that iPad right up next to that and took a picture of that Jesus first bed, like he was going to make a big deal about that. But that night, that bed, God said to me, Harris, it's one thing to say Jesus is first. It's one thing to even wear a lapel pin that would tell people that you want Jesus to be first. It's another whole story to have to prove it. Harris, that family proved it. They proved it. I still have my Jesus first pin, but I haven't worn it since that night. One day, I hope there'll be a season I'll wear it again, but for now, I wear this pin every day that I'm putting on a sport coat or a suit. I transfer this pin to that suit. Days I'm not wearing a sport coat, I'll take it off and I'll carry it in my pocket. So, Mark, why do you do that? Really just two reasons. One, it's because I don't ever want to forget that not last week or last month, not next week or next month, but today. Today, on October 27th, 2015, a family in Iraq and a family in Syria suffered the same demise as that family that Tony Perkins described. It's happening every day. And number two, I don't ever want to forget that no matter where I go or what I do, I don't want to teeter with ever forsaking or denying my faith in what I believe. And I would never ask you to deny your faith in what you believe. Why? Because that's religious freedom. That's America. God bless you.
Yes. Is this on?
That's on.
Many of us are evangelical Bible-based Christians here in the group, and I want to thank you, Mark, for the encouragement about us being on the offensive and talking about what, Les, you had said at the very beginning. You made reference to the Trojan horses and some of these people coming in being somewhat of a danger to us. I would think the biblical model, the evangelical model, would be embrace these people coming in, to go on the offensive, because those people are running away from ISIS. Those people are running away from persecution and evil. And many times their theology and their background as communists or Chinese or whatever their background is wafer thin. They're not theologians. Many times they're very shallow in their understanding of their faith. If we embrace them and love them just like Jesus did the woman at the well, we should be taking the offensive as the body of Christ.
Right. That's true, actually. The opportunity to actually reach those people with the gospel, with the good news, the relationship with God, so on, through Jesus. On an individual basis, when we encounter those people, that should be our goal. In my book, Simple Islam, at the end, I actually talk about how to be friends with Muslim people and reach out to them and love them. And that's certainly what we should do. It's more on a geopolitical level that I'm talking about the danger and the very fact that the refugee communities have embeds from ISIS among the refugees. I agree we shouldn't just brand all of the refugees as dangerous, but we have to recognize the danger that is there. There was an article just today, in fact, in Jordan, in the refugee camps in Jordan, there was an account where within the camps, I don't know if you've seen pictures of them, but there's just thousands and thousands of people, tent after tent, thousands of tents of refugees from Syria into Jordan. And ISIS comes into those refugee camps, finds out they're Christians, and kills them, and threatens everybody else, if you say anything, we'll kill you too. And they rape the women, they're taking the women and the girls as slaves. And within the refugee camp. and they're getting away with it. So I was thinking really on the political level, and what's, the intent of ISIS and the radical Islam. But on a personal level, I appreciate you bringing that up. On a personal level, we definitely need to reach out and love, and show love and compassion, and reach out to individual people.
I don't understand how we can call it radical Islam when there's a total inconsistency between Islamic Sharia law and Christianity. So why do we keep calling it?
I'll answer that. That's not a problem. In terms of the system of Islam and the belief of the Quran and the Sunnah, the Hadith of Muhammad, there's no comparison. It's totally contradictory. It's irreconcilable to the Bible. However, not all Muslims are actually committed to radical jihadism. I don't want you too long to answer the question, but pick a percentage. Let's say that 10% of Muslims are actually radicalized or committed to jihad, and the other 90% are just trying to live their lives. Okay, even though they believe Islam, they're not actually good. Technically, they're not good Muslims. A good Muslim becomes a radical if they're really faithful to Islam. So the tenets are, you're right about that. But there are many Muslims that are just moderates living in society. The question isn't really the proportions or how many moderates, how many radicals within the community of Islam, but how many does it take to take over? And a good example is Nazi Germany. All the Germans were Nazis, but a certain percentage were Nazis, and they were able to take over. It's sort of like, who's driving the bus is the question. And so I choose to use the term radical Islam just to make sure everybody understands I'm talking about the ones that are absolutely committed to jihad, and they're committed. Even if it was 10%, that's out of 1.5 billion, that's still 150 million suicide bombers. 1% is still 15 million. So it doesn't matter how many there are, it matters how committed they are. And those are the ones we're concerned about. The ones who aren't that committed are the ones we can actually reach and tell them about the living God, the God of life rather than the God of death. And so that's what we try to do and recognize the difference.
Aside from working individually as we can to promote these causes, is there any organization, like a non-government organization or other group that, in your opinions, have been successful that we could rally behind to protect the refugees, like the non-Islamic groups that have been persecuted overseas?
I think particularly this plan is really good like that.
I think you're looking for groups,
groups
that are getting
effective.
Christians out or getting non-Islamists, refugees taken care of.
Right. They are the Islamists are persecuting Christians, Jewish people, Buddhists, Hindus, all of these other groups.
Right. There are groups. I just happened to have had my radio on and heard Glenn Beck recently. He has a group that actually is trying to do that, raising up people who actually will get, I think, out of Syria or maybe the Jordanian refugee camps, but looking actually for Christians to rescue them.
There is a guy, actually, I turned my phone back on because I was going to try to track down the name of his organization. I think it's called the Chaldean Project. He was one of the individuals that went on the trip to Israel with AIPAC that I just got back from last Tuesday. Interestingly enough, he's out of San Diego. There was a feature, some of you may have seen it a couple weeks ago on a Saturday night called Crossing Jordan. And this gentleman was actually featured in there. He has reached out to former Congressman Duncan Hunter. to try to, he's met with the president several times. He said the president does not understand the situation. Shock of all shocks. But that he genuinely believes that there are ways, and he is working through his organization. I think it's called the Chaldean Project. If I can get the name here, I'll share it with you in just a minute.
It's interesting. Years ago, before all of this happened, I was in D.C. and a taxi driver claimed he was a Chaldean Christian, and he knew the Bible about that. I bet his understanding of the Bible would rival anybody else's here. He was just so, here he was driving a taxi.
I like to say that the Christians in these countries where they're being persecuted, sometimes as evangelical Christians, we might say, oh, they're from some church, they don't really know Jesus, But if you stand up for Jesus, it doesn't matter if you're an Egyptian Coptic or a Russian Orthodox or whatever you are. If you're willing to die for him, I agree with what Dr. Harris says. It puts us to shame.
His name is Mark Arabo, Arabo, and he's the CEO of the Neighborhood Marketing Association, Chaldean American spokesman. He's a Chaldean American spokesman.
Right here.
I have two questions. The first is just this week in the news, a Muslim gentleman accepted a job that involved delivering alcohol. And because he was giving problems regarding delivering alcohol, he got fired. And our Justice Department defended him. And he won, I think it was $240,000. And then back in sometime when Eric Holder was holding that position, there was a Muslim school employee who wanted to take time off in the school year to make whatever they call it when they go to makeup. And the school had said no because it would interrupt their program. Well, our Justice Department defended her. She was allowed to go. So my question is, here we have Christians who are being denied. I mean, the principles are the same. Even Kim Davis and this gentleman, the principles are the same. It could not that be taken to court somehow? Don't we have a case that, how would we present a case in some court to say, hey, these two are the same wise one given?
Well, I think that case is going to be decided as something called the ballot box. And you're not going to see the changes that you pointed out clearly, the inconsistencies. You pointed out clearly and made the case for the double standard. But unfortunately, that's going to have to change at the ballot box, where we elect leaders who share the values that you share. And I'm still a firm believer, regardless of what the media tries to sell us, that there still is a majority of Americans who believe in truth and want to stand for truth and what is right. And I think it's a matter of, as I was saying earlier, if you're looking for action, you got to get involved, and we got to start informing and equipping and alerting and mobilizing, because that's where the change is going to come.
This is kind of a two-parter. Dr. Harris, first part's to you, Dr. Harris, because you were there, and then seconds to both of you. In terms of Serbia, I presume they don't allow the Islamic Quran to be read over the PA systems like they do and like they try to at Duke and where they do at other places throughout the world. I just wondered if that, real quick, and then, yes or no. And then the other is regarding Putin, where in the past Putin, say what you will about him, he stood up against Islam, and now what's going on with him? What is he doing? He's involved in Syria. Is he killing Christians? Whose side is he on?
Yeah.
That's a question.
Well, all I gathered while we were over there is he was dropping bombs on the rebels. He's protecting Assad. I think that's pretty clear that he has a vested interest there. And he's going to be the major player, he believes, in the Middle East at this particular point. And a lot of those countries look for somebody to be the leader because they're just all, I mean, Syria is no longer a country. I mean, we call it Syria, but it's not. It's all these different terrorist groups controlling different areas. It's now the country formerly known as Syria. So to the Putin point, I think he's going to continue to flex his muscle where he can, and we're going to need some new leadership with a strong foreign policy. But I will say, in Serbia, interestingly enough, the cornfields that are out there, many Muslims have been making deals about coming in and buying the cornfields in the northern part of Serbia. And the deal of buying those cornfields is they want to build mosques for their people that are going to be coming there to work. Now, I will say in the 4 years that we went over there in our partnership, where we were, I never heard Muslim prayers over loudspeakers, so I would assume, to your point, that they don't do that now. But the government of Serbia is teetering with that right now.